Is that I also get to ask questions, so I'll go ahead with the first one.
Okay.
So as a political scientist, I have conducted research in the past about comparing political participation between the US and other developed democratic societies. And I'm sure we've all known by now is that when we compare the US to other Western democratic societies, we're pretty horrendous when it comes to political participation. So there's a theory in political science called path dependence that uses historical analysis as part of its methodology, in particular using or examining critical junctures. So as a historian, can you think of any particular moment in US history that can help explain why political participation is low in the US?
Sure. Okay, so one good example of why political participation has declined in the United States has to do with the state taking on work that had previously been done by the political parties. Housing assistance, employment assistance, welfare assistance, all those sorts of things up into the very early 20th century were the function of urban political bosses, and not exclusively urban political bosses because there were rural political bosses as well. So this political boss system where the political bosses were deeply ingrained with a particular political party would be known in the community. If you have an issue, go see this person working with Boss Tweed's organization and he'll hook you up with a job. He'll help you find housing. With the rise of a welfare state with social services for employment, for housing, etc., coming through the state as opposed to through the boss system, participation in politics was less pragmatically transactional, in that the voter didn't have the immediate economic need that could be provided by the party worker, the boss, that his father or grandfather might have had in the very early 20th or late 19th century. So the taking on by the state of some of these functions that had happened through the parties are part of it. The notion also in the late 19th century of the party as this club to which you were a member dissipates a bit with the rise of mass culture in the 20th century. Think about what life must have been like in a largely rural society where there was no movie theater, no YouTube, no television, no radio even. Your life is about farming, and maybe you don't even own the farm. But it's political season, and there's going to be a candidate in town on Saturday, and there's going to be a barbecue, and there are going to be a lot of speeches, and there's going to be some music. There was a sort of club-like, there was a cultural component to political participation that went beyond, oh yeah, it's primary election day, I've got to remember to go vote. Oh, it's Tuesday, I've got to remember to go vote. It was your identity with the party extended beyond the election. I don't know if that helps or not, but those are two examples.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
A little while ago we had a guy named Stephen Finberg at our college who's written, as you know, a biography of Jesse Jones, and I told him to think about this beforehand. I didn't want to ambush him during the Q&A, to talk about what he thought Jesse Jones might say about this current campaign. And I thought about that, you know, Jesse Jones would be the equivalent today of a multi-billionaire, that, you know, he would have a profound discomfort. But to my astonishment, Stephen Finberg argued if Jesse Jones were around, he would be supporting Bernie Sanders because of his work, RFC, Reconstruction Finance Corporate, which goes back to Hoover, of course, that Jesse Jones was arguing if I had billions more to put into infrastructure, how much that would help. His conservative Democrat, to be sure, but his belief in the role of the state in promoting economic development. And I wonder if you think that's so preposterous an answer. And the other thing I want to say was the irony I think about when you speak is how it's the socialists in this campaign who's defending the New Deal.
Yeah.
Now, Bernie Sanders is not saying nationalize the banks, as Gene Debs or Norman Thomas might have said. He's saying break them up, restore Glass-Steagall. He talks about the public works initiatives of the Roosevelt administration. I went to a high school right across the freeway from U of H that was built by the WPA, Stephen F. Austin, and opened in 1937. And I wonder if you think that says something about the state of our politics, that it's only this old socialist with this weird accent who has the cojones to speak for New Deal liberalism.
I think you're exactly right, Steve, and I do think that Jesse Jones would be supporting Bernie Sanders today. Jesse Jones and many of his Texas cronies from the 1930s get wrongly tarnished as not being New Dealers. And I ask my graduate students, was FDR a New Dealer? And I make the argument that FDR himself was not really a New Dealer. Because the New Dealers were the intellectuals who came to Washington, who were the heroes of the liberals in the 30s and the liberals ever since, because their liberalism was pure as anyone in politics can be. And someone who actually holds elective office does not have the luxury of purity of thought. And FDR was an experimenter. We're going to try this. If it works, we'll keep it. If it doesn't work, we'll throw it out and we'll try this other thing. There's an apocryphal story about FDR going to give a speech where about half the audience was going to be union workers and the other half of the audience was going to be Chamber of Commerce types. And so he had a couple of speechwriters working on the speeches, and he just took the speech that the speechwriter had written for the union audience and cut and paste it, to use language of the 21st century, with the speech that the other speechwriter had written for the Chamber of Commerce audience, and gave the same speech, and everybody clapped because they all heard something that made them happy. Back to Jesse Jones and his Texas cronies and allies, and I'm thinking of also the Vice President, John Nance Garner, who gets a bad reputation for being more conservative than I think he was. Their big gripe was with New York banks that charged exorbitant interest rates in Texas, that did not fairly develop Texas and places like Texas. And Jones saw the Reconstruction Finance Corporation as this opportunity to use federal dollars to build the Texas infrastructure. Texas comes out of the New Deal years and the World War II years a very different place from the Texas that went into it. It is on the fast track to being an urban place. Oil is as important at the end of the war as agriculture, if not more important by the end of the war. And there are more than a few industrial war plants that were built in Texas, and Jesse Jones has a hand in that. Jesse Jones was a capitalist, but he was also what I would call a state capitalist, that he saw the benefit of the federal government playing a role in capitalist development of regions. He believed that capitalism unfettered would see that the resources would all continue to channel to that one place where they had been going, and then if the state gets involved through some form of state capitalism with the RFC and the like, that there will be a chance for economies to grow and thrive in places where there had not been more advanced economies previously. So no, I can see Jesse Jones with his field of burn going on.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit to, I'm struck by the theme of whether poverty is seen as something to be ashamed of, and what we witnessed as, I think in your talk, the demonization of the poor, or the dismissal of the poor, misrepresenting them. Welfare queens was one of the examples. But the way in which poverty and race begin to fold on each other, and so the systemic racism, or our ability to have racism triggered, particularly if you're white. around poverty and the way in which so many of the poorest areas, Flint being an example, are also areas that are densely populated by people of color. And these are also the areas in which I would suggest that one other thing that's happening that compares us with Europe, that we actually suppress votes, whereas many European states, the state's job is to get people to is to be sure they vote, right, and they make that very easy. But could you talk a little bit about the way race is intertwined, which would take us back to civil rights, I guess?
Yeah. There's a lot going on in your question there. Yes, and that's so simplistic that it doesn't really even deserve airtime. But we wanted to think that because there's this notion among some in society, and I have trouble explaining this to students. I'll never forget this student who was not born in the United States who came to talk to me after one of my civil rights lectures and just could not understand that it was that bad. And I'd had, what, 50 or 75 minutes to talk about civil rights, and it was worse. It was worse. I barely got into it. I gave you 75 minutes worth of information on racial atrocity and efforts to change that in the 40s and 50s and 60s. It was worse, it was worse, it was worse. In part for that particular student, he grew up in another country. He had lived in the United States for maybe 2 years before he was in my class, and he had either Obama was running or had just been elected president at the time. I don't remember whether it was 08 or 09 when this happened. And so how can it be that really have been that bad? After all, you've got a black president, he says to me. And for many in society, Civil Rights 64, Voting Rights 65, and to a lesser extent the housing legislation from 1968 checked off the civil rights boxes. Problem solved. Second problem solved. Third problem solved. Okay, next, let's move on. Without digging in and understanding that far more problems continued to exist, and the solving of one problem, this is a point that I make when I'm talking about civil rights and how the movement changed and evolved over time. The solving of one problem didn't cause anyone involved with the movement to sit back and rest on their laurels and say, okay, great, we took care of that problem. It identified 10 more problems, right? So with the Montgomery bus boycott, okay, ultimately the problem of busing in Montgomery was solved after the boycott worked, but it points out more problems. But if you don't want to see the problems, if you just want to read the headline, boycott resolved, Civil Rights Act signed, etc., etc. Oh, okay, so we don't have that problem anymore. So there's that, problem solved mentality without really knowing the full extent of what's going on. And then that layers on top of the economic shifts that are making us much more isolated within our own communities. There was a historian who wrote a book about the progressive era, and he talked about how the island communities, Robert Wiebe, the island communities of the 19th century were increasingly eliminated with the progressive era and the bringing together of American civilization into a national civilization through politics and through society and mass culture and the like. And I would argue, we've gone back to our islands in the last 20, 30, 40 years. We're back on our islands. We don't know people who aren't like us. And so if the image of an African American to some middle-class white person in southern Illinois, where I lived for 10 years, is a criminal and a person on welfare, then they take that to be every African American, and they don't really know that the majority of African Americans are not on welfare, are moving into the middle class, if not in the middle class, that that the crime statistics are about a small segment of a much larger, much more diverse population in the country. If you don't want to dig beneath the surface, if you're in your late 20th, early 21st century island, and that was something that I found when I was at this college in Southern Illinois that was largely white and largely rural, and most of the kids had never been outside of the 30-mile radius of where they lived, and if they'd been to St. Louis, which was 19 miles away from college, they had been there for one of two reasons: a Cardinals game or Mardi Gras, and they had not really ventured into any other aspect of St. Louis. It was really night and day moving from that teaching environment to the University of Houston, with the University of Houston being a much preferable, in so many ways, teaching environment. But yeah, I think that plays into it. And then I think I don't want to be too unfair to President Reagan, but I don't think I'm being unfair to President Reagan. Being poor does get demonized in the 80s. And being poor was normal in a whole bunch of ways. Professor O'Rourke talked about poverty being normal in the beat movement and in the hippies in the 60s, but it was also normal for the greatest generation, right? Because they all grew up poor. I will remember, I mean, my parents are greatest generation. My dad was born in 1920 and my mom was born in 1923. They skipped a generation because they married late and they were in their 40s when they had me. So, you know, I'm kind of a generational oddity myself by having greatest generation parents, but really being not quite, you know, at the very, very end of the baby boomer, depending on what demographic you want to go with. But my mom was a saver. She was like so many Depression-era people. She saved everything. And when I moved my parents out of their house, you know, I'm finding garbage bag after garbage bag after garbage bag filled with used pantyhose. I mean, who knows what that was. But they went straight in the trash. I mean, they were already in a garbage bag, so if there was any money in there, somebody found it in the dump. I don't think there was any money in there. But she would save bread sacks. And I remember when it rained at school, if I needed new galoshes, but they still fit my feet, I didn't get new galoshes until my foot had gotten so big. Rubber boots. I didn't get new rubber boots until my foot was literally too big to go in the boot. So I had to go to school with bread sacks over my rubber boots. That is not what you want to do when you're 9, 10 years old. And this is the 1970s, where consumption and conspicuous consumption is ramping up again. You know, we're not going to see it full on until the 1980s, but it's ramping up again. But poverty was normal for this greatest generation, whether they were whether they had anything to do with the beats or not. You know, being poor was normal. Everybody experienced poverty during the Great Depression in some way, shape, or form. It was just in gradations. But while we have wider income inequality now because we're in our islands, we don't know if we're fortunate enough to not be poor. We don't know people who are, and we don't know what it's like, and so it's easy to stereotype. And stereotyping also is this pill that we take. It's as good as any other placebo pill we might take in a medical study. But if we take the pill and we can say, well, poor people are black and I'm white, so I'm not going to be poor. You know, the stereotype becomes this placebo pill where we can inoculate ourselves and say, that's not going to happen to us because I'm not that. I'm not that. That's not. So, yeah, pretty harsh, I think, on my part. But you've been trying for so long. That's okay.
That's okay. I do want to remind people that I'm here and I'm registering people to vote. And if you're registered to vote, but if you want to take a card, someone at home needs to register to vote, please take the card and I'll be happy to answer any questions. We also have a voting machine so I can answer questions on how to vote. How to use the machine, I should say. My question involves empowerment of people, and I just think think that one of the best means of rising out of poverty is to delay having children. And our culture right now, the religious right and the political right, are telling people, don't plan. Don't plan. There's some mystical person up there or creature up there that's going to take care of you. Don't do any family planning. And I think the whole movement against Planned Parenthood is really not about abortion. I think it's about don't use family planning. Don't use birth control. And I'm wondering how, because and when people have so many children, then they don't get the education they need. I don't think they can engage in the system. They cannot participate in helping improve all of that infrastructure and the whole, improving the lot for everyone. So I just wondered if you wanted to.
Yeah, I definitely think you're onto something there. So I graduated from high school in 1982 from a small rural East Texas place. And so I guess I'm in really the first generation or generation and a half of young women for which legal abortion was an opportunity, right? Graduated high school, 82. And this did go along racial lines in my high school. I don't know of a single African-American girl who got pregnant who had an abortion. And my high school was small. There were like 40 of us in the graduating class, so everybody knew everybody's business. It's a small town. Everybody knows everybody's business. I don't know of a single African-American girl who got pregnant who had an abortion. And every white girl who got pregnant had an abortion in my high school. And that played into the future possibilities for those who did and those who did not start families while in high school. I don't want to put myself in the position of telling somebody else when they can or can't, should or shouldn't have a family, but I think you're right. The longer you wait, the more economically prepared you are to care for the child. If you have your college out of the way, then A, you get to be a college student while you're in college, and it's kind of fun to be a college student. It's kind of fun to not have to worry quite so much about what time you get home, having to support someone else, and just, having just enough fun so you can have your college experience, but getting your work done in your classes to graduate, to get your degree, to go on to a career somewhere. And I can't imagine what my college years would have been like if I had had to support a child while I was in college. Would I have made it through? It would have been so much harder. I see so many women in my classes at UH. One of the wonderful things about UH is we're always there. If you majored in Budweiser as opposed to biology the first time out in college and didn't quite make it through when you were 22 and had to go into the workforce, we're still there when you're 32 or 42 and get ready to come back. And I hear from women who had a child early and come back, just how hard it is for them. And I kind of am internally shaking my head as the 18 to 22-year-old who does not have the responsibility of a child is complaining about how they can't get this paper done by Wednesday, and the single mom with the 3 kids at home and 1 in college is getting the paper done by Wednesday. No offense to college students out there, because I was like that when I was in college. I mean, I wasn't the most responsible person in the world when I was in college. The speeches I give my students often are, don't do these things, and most of the things I did, like don't wait till the night before to write a paper, don't wait until the night before to study. I did those things. Somehow I managed to get through. But it's easier when you don't wait until the night before. It's easier when you allow yourself to be young while in college. And I mean, old people can have kids. I had my son when I was 42 years old, so that's probably at the high end of waiting. But I am an advocate if it's right for you. I don't want to tell somebody I believe in all aspects of choice. So if somebody chooses to have a child when they're young, that's their choice. And as a professor, I want to help them in every way possible to make it through school. But I do think there is wisdom in waiting. There's a wonderful book a colleague of mine, Elizabeth Gregory, wrote. I think the title of it is Waiting. It's something like that. It's about older mothers postponing childbirth until later in life, and it's not very academic or not jargony. Elizabeth keeps it real in the writing of the book, I think, and it's pretty interesting. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but I think
I'm just thinking. I'm seeing an institutional or a whole movement toward just telling people, don't be empowered, don't plan ahead.
Yeah,
as an individual.
I think that's correct as well. I think that there is that going on. The war on Planned Parenthood is Exhibit A in that. The unwillingness of those who want to defund Planned Parenthood to see that it is not primarily about abortion, it's about health care, and it's about mammograms for women of a certain age, and it's about, the only access to health care for women who don't have health insurance or good health insurance, and planning a child, or planning when to have a child and when not to have a child. It's about all of those things. Yeah, I think that there is something going on there where there is a segment of society who would prefer for there to be no family planning. Would like to roll all of those victories from the 20th century back, all the way back to eliminating the work of Margaret Sanger before she became a eugenicist, or full-on eugenicist.
Thank you, Nancy Beck Young, for that enlightening presentation. I would like to present this gift to you.
Thank you.
For giving us the opportunity to broaden our horizons on this particular issue. So thank you again for that.